Welcome back, woodworkers, to part 3 in this series of making a plywood tool chest. This plywood tool chest, see, you're even getting an intro now. I must be getting the hang of this a little bit. So in part 1 we did the overview of the tool chest and the construction. In part 2 I looked at the timber requirements, put up the cut-in list, and a few tips on that, and getting the plywood to the size that you want. Now in part 3 we're going to look at marking out your timber, your plywood, ready to start drilling and counterboring so that we can get this thing assembled and get it into 3D. So let's get on with it. Next I'm going to start getting the carcass together. So those two ends are just balanced on there at the moment. If there's a draft comes through, they're going to fall down, so be prepared. One other thing to mention is thinking about inside, outside, top, bottom, so on, and labelling it all up, because in some ways you might think, well, it doesn't really matter, but it does, because if you've got ply that's got a bit of damage on it, if you've got patches in the ply, which you often get from the manufacturers, then you can choose where it's going to be. So if you've got a damaged area, you might want to put it at the bottom on the outside so that the skirt covers it. If you've got a patch, you might want that to be on the outside, because the outside is going to be painted, but the inside you're probably going to just leave bare, or you're going to oil it, and the inside is the bit that's seen. So you can choose what's inside, outside, labelled up your parts like you were making a handmade wooden box with joints. You know, corner 1, 2, 3 and 4, inside, outside, top, bottom, and so on, so that when you're picking these big panels up, there's not that situation where you go and drill on the wrong side of the board or something like that. So it's just good habit to get in whatever you're making. Okay, so we want to mark out where our drill holes are going to be for counterboring the corners of our box. So you need to make sure, obviously, we're working on the large panels, the front and the back, and you're working from what you've designated to be the outside, because you might leave, you might put the ply where there's patches or faults on the outside, because you know you're going to paint them or cover it up with the skirt, whereas you know on the inside it's going to be seen and it's going to be bare ply, and you're probably going to oil it or something. So if it makes no difference, it makes no difference, but just mark them so that you mark everything in the right place. So this is my outside. I want a line 9mm from the edge, because obviously I've got 18mm ply coming this on the ends, and I want the lines to be, I want the line to be in that midpoint. So you can either just measure in 9mm and 9mm and draw a straight line, it'll be fine. But if you've got a combination square, the easiest thing is to set it to 9mm and then just run your combination square along with your pencil and give yourself a line all the way along. And then we need to mark the spacings. There's going to be 5 screw holes in. We want the 2 end ones, we want 30mm in from each end, and then the gaps are 100. So it's as easy to just go along the tape measure and go 30, 130, 230, 330, and then the final one will be at 430, which is obviously 30mm from that end because it's 460. So that spreads the load out. We've got one in the centre, we've got 2 at the ends, and the end being 30 is important, because when we cut the lid off, if this is your top, it might be this end, doesn't really matter, we're going to cut this off at 70mm. So we're now left with a screw pretty much in the centre of that 70mm. And it'll actually be 82 because it'll have a top on it by then of 12mm thick ply, but 70mm. So if we'd have put that fixing down here, we lose the fixing. If we put it at 70, we cut into a screw. So just lay them out. If they're slightly out side to side, doesn't really make any difference. The important thing is that they're halfway this way, and that we drill down correctly and squarely. So you've got 20 to mark out. Once they're marked out, we can get on to counterboring them and get this thing together. One other point to mention about the way that you fix the corners of the box. You can do it in other ways. There's so many other options, lamellos, dominoes, you name it. Somebody's come up with a system, and some of them really, really good at doing this sort of thing. And even sort of good old biscuits, you know, putting biscuit joints in. Obviously on that case, you're not going to be working from the front, you'll be working from the back. But the main thing is, however you decide to do it, you've got to space these things out, thinking about the fact that we're going to make a complete cube and then we're going to cut the lid off. And the lid is going to be cut off 70mm from the top. So if you've decided which your top is, it will be 70mm from the top, and by then it'll have a 12mm top on it. So it will be 82, but 70 for this piece. So what you don't want to do is be cutting through your fixing, or you don't want to put a screw bang on that point or something that you don't want to be cutting through. And you also want to leave a fixing in your lid section. There's no good putting your first screw down here and then finding when you cut the lid off, the only thing that's holding it together is some glue on the edges of end grain, and mostly end grain plywood. So actually making sure you've got fixing at 30mm, cutting it off at 70 means there's a nice good fixing in the centre of that lid section. But you can use whatever you've got. But this way, you know, counterboring, you only need a couple of drill bits and some screws and a pot of glue, and you're away. So it's the most accessible, I think, combined with giving it a strong finish. Right, for those of you who don't know what counterboring is, I'm going to show you now, but also for those who do and have done it many times, at least for this tool chest and the sizes, I'll just show you how I do it. So counterboring, all we're going to do is we're going to drill a larger hole with a Forstner bit. So this is an 8mm Forstner bit. So that's going to go probably around a third of the way through our ply, so maybe 5-6mm in. The spur will leave a little bit of a pip at the bottom of that hole, which we can then follow on with a clearance hole for the screw, which I've got a 3.5mm drill because the gauge of the screw is a 3.5mm, 40mm long screw. So you can vary it, go for a thicker screw, go for a thicker clearance hole, and so on. But the other good thing is, if you make a little block from an offcut, you've then got a depth stop, so that if you're then going to set a pillar drill to do this with, you can then do that. And I've marked in 9mm, which is exactly the depth, the distance that you need to drill in from the edge of your board, because obviously the board coming off it this way is 18mm, so it needs to be halfway. So actually that means this can act as a depth stop for setting the depth stop on your pillar drill, your vertical, but also you can put this up against your back fence on your drill table if you've got one, and that means then you can move the board along, and you've already set this distance as well. So all you've got to concentrate is getting it on, and actually that's the least important one. If you happen to drill it a little bit over here or here, it doesn't really make any difference, but it does if you change this distance, and it does if you drill, if you drill too far. So for this one, I'm looking at about 5-6mm, which I've set the vernier to. As it happens, it's pretty much on this Rutland's 8mm Forstner, it's the size. So actually, if you're just doing these by hand with the cordless, you can sort of go down to the main bulk of the drill, the cutting head, and that's pretty much where you need to be. So if I come in, pop that onto my mark and just drill in. Okay. So I'm leaning over camera there, so trying to get some pressure down. So now what we've got is we've got our hole, which is distance that we want. We've got our pip there, so then we can come in with our 3.5mm. And obviously if you're doing it by hand, you just want to be as vertical as you can. You can look along the line this way. You can see them from the opposite direction. Drill that through. Once you're through, you've got that there. That means that then when we put the board together, we can put that screw in, that screw will go through there. We'll have glued it as well, screw it, and then we can then put a beach plug in the top. This will be a little bit lower. This can be put in there with a bit of glue, flush cut it off, paint it. If you don't want to make beach plugs, make them out of pine, doesn't really matter because you're going to be painting over the top anyway. So that's counterboring. So for me, it's 3.5 by 40 mil screws. Therefore, a 3.5 mil drill for the clearance hole and an 8mm force and a bit for the first hole. You can make that 10 if you want. Some screws have got bigger heads on them, but of course the bigger you make it, the closer your hole gets to the edge of your board. So that's up to you to have a look at, but that's what I find works well for me. Now that can now go and be used on the drill press to set it up for repeat cutting. So now that block that I just did as a demo, I've marked up Plywood Tool Chest setup block, 8mm force and a bit, 9mm to the edge, and depth 6mm. And then what I've been able to do is then use that to be able to set the fence up, 9mm, and to set my depth stop on my drill, so that when I come down, and I'll see if I can do this while holding the camera, then that now bottoms out and I can then put the edge of my board along here and just move it side to side and do repeat cuts, and then that goes in a box with my other setup blocks for the tool chest for different processes. It just makes repeating easy because you think you'll always remember, and if you don't make one for another few months, or in some cases weeks, you'll forget. So that is all set up, ready to go if I want to do them that way. But to be honest, the last one I think I did by hand. Just with a cordless, it's fine.
This is King Emerson coming to you from the original Mr. Bumble's Funk and Break Mix, celebrating 50 years of hip-hop. The first cut of the Akashian break, the word shame.
I've just listened back to the counterbore section and there's a lot of noise in the background, squawking. I'm on a farm here, and where my metal shutter doors are behind me, they hold the heat, and ducks, pheasants, all sorts all gather out there. So I apologise for that. One thing before I finish is just to say, I can't say on a short video the millions of different ways of doing something. So there'll always be somebody will have a different idea, a different way of doing it. But just to say, even for counterboring, you can now buy the combined drill. So you've got your clearance hole and you've got your counterbore all in one. But finding the right combination for some of the jobs, it's as easy just to grab your drills and your forceners and do it anyway. But it's just another option to say is out there. We've now got everything marked out. We've got everything ready to do the counterbore and the clearance holes. So in part 4, we're going to start putting this thing together. So it'll literally be the 4 pieces on the bench. We'll start pilot drilling, put the screws in, get the glue, and get the whole thing to a rectangular cube. So that will be in part 4, which I'll hopefully get uploaded quite soon. But thank you for watching. Spread the word, subscribe, comment, all that YouTubey stuff. Thank you very much.